Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. Uh, Kind of a fun day. This is the third take. Uh, Actually, it's the fourth or fifth. I wanted to figure out how to connect this microphone. It's supposed to give better sound, and I finally figured out how to connect it. It should be a real simple task, but it wasn't for me. Um, and So then it turns out that there's things you have to learn about sound level and gain, stuff like that. And they even tell you, well, you really should have a boom stand so the mic is right here in front of your face, so you're 6 to 8 inches away from it for best sound quality. Well, I'm certainly not vain. I'm not in love with my face. But I do think that my face is part of how you make an assessment of how much of what I'm saying you are willing to accept. Um, I'm making a very, very big claim that we're not just social, which we all know. We're so social that we're a gift to each other. And I need to offer support for that claim. And the facial expressions are part of that support that people have anciently used to try to figure out how trustworthy the speaker is. So I'm going to keep the mic down here where it's a little too far away for maximum results, but we're going to go with that. Um, okay, so the other thing is, in the last couple of days, I've been getting a little more technical than usual, and honestly, I perhaps haven't done the best job. These are very difficult materials, and I've been struggling to try to present them in a coherent fashion, simply and more or less directly. And my daughter Betsy cautioned me that I'm getting into the weeds, and I usually listen when she tells me that because she knows it before I do, and she's usually right. So, but I have a concern, and I'm gonna have to be honest. I really do need to offer support for my point of view because my point of view is a fairly fundamental difference in the traditional point of view. Uh, we haven't really, focused in a long, long time um, on awe. And to say that awe is the beginning of our psychology and that it gives us a sense of connection to each other that makes us turn to each other and be a gift to each other, um, that's a big statement. Um, it's not one that can be proven or disproven. It's intuitive. It's a point of view about our situation vis-a-vis each other and the world around us. But you can offer things in support of the reasonableness of a point of view, though you can't prove it at this level. Um, and I do feel it's my job to offer things in support of the reasonableness of the point of view. Um, so I'm going to have to give you some material extracted from this hundreds and hundreds of difficult books I've read over the decades that I've been doing this instead of a regular job. Um, I'm going to have to give you, some depth. I'll try my best to keep it clean and simple. Um, okay, so we've been talking about Terence Deacon's book, which is the first one that I've mentioned to you that says that about 2 to 2.5 million years ago, people began to live as bonded pairs in society. Now, there's plenty of other books that say that that occurred at about that time. And I'll bring those books up to you in the next few months. Um, but humor me just a minute. The last one of these I recorded, I forgot to press the mute button. So there wasn't any sound. I just want to be sure. I've rested this time. Okay, so I'm not exactly a tech wizard. So the question is, why did this change occur? And we want to explain it in terms that uh, traditional scientists are saying are, sensible. They're not bad science. Um, I mean, I grew up a Catholic, and my parents and teachers were Catholic, and they very reluctantly followed the church when the church said, well, look, based on Darwin, we have to say that Genesis is not literally true. The important parts of Genesis, the church said, are still valid, that the world is created by a loving creator God, um, and that this God wants us to live certain ways. Um, but the details of the world's creation can't be any longer offered as Genesis offered them, because that's entirely contradicted by good science. And we just can't be offering things entirely contradicted by good science as a part of our theology and philosophy and approach to life. So um, I'm trying, when I read these books, um, to find ways of offering support for the gift of each other that doesn't, fall outside what I consider sound science. Now, uh, so Deacon offered the explanation that the change occurred when men decided that now that they'd learned how to butcher meat and bring it back to the camp and provision women, that they wouldn't just provision a bunch of women and have sex with a bunch of women, that they would provision one woman. And he said the reason they did that is because they wanted the progeny of that woman, who they were provisioning as well, to be their progeny. And he viewed that as a Darwinian adaptation that was acceptable in standard science terms. Um, Now, the point I've made is I don't think people had enough brain power to know that sex leads to babies. I think that people had sex because there was a tremendous natural urge to have sex, and they used and people, our ancestor species, were having sex with multiple partners. So why did they change to having sex in a bonded pair? Um, and his explanation just doesn't seem to hold water for me. That I just don't think they knew the connection between sex and babies. And so it couldn't have been that they wanted to make sure that the progeny they were provisioning were their own. Um, I think that Jablonka and Lamb, in this book, Evolution in Four Dimensions, that I mentioned earlier in the series of podcasts, give the new view. They're saying the younger evolutionary biologists see evolution as subject to four factors and not just um, accidental mutations of the genetic material. And the four factors they offer are in the subtitle. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds about what they mean. So I'll just tell you the subtitle is called Genetic, Epigenetic, Behavioral, and Symbolic Variation in the History of Life. Now, this book by Jablonka and Lamb has a revised edition in 2014, and you sure want to buy that one. Um, that the revisions are critical. Um, and they were based on research results in the 10 years since they had written the original book. Um, and their whole point of view is that the world of evolutionary biology has changed in the last decade or so, or that the younger people in this discipline are accepting more than just the physical changes. And so, one of the changes, it seems to me, that could explain this change, one of the things that could explain this change, it seems to me, is that uh, the beginnings of a rudimentary sense of self developed in the psychology that's emerging from our physical brain as our physical brain gets larger and more complex. At this time period, from 2.5 million to 2 million years ago, there were significant changes in our physical brain and in our general intelligence that had allowed us at the beginning of that time period to start using stone tools. And 500,000 years is enough time for a fair amount of evolution to occur. Is my not contention, because I can't offer this as a scientific contention, but it's my idea that it's possible that our psychology became emerged in a rudimentary form, but sufficiently for our emotions to take over, including the emotions of wanting intimacy to be associated with sex. And whether that happened more in the female or in both male and female together, uh, I can't tell you. Whether it was accompanied by selfish motivations, so that the female thought, gee, I'm going to, look for the best provisioner, and I'm going to have intimacy with him alone, so that I get the most chance for the provisioning that he can offer just for me, instead of him offering it to a bunch of women that he's having sex with. So he and I will be bonded, and yeah, I'll get all his provisioning. Um, to me, I much prefer the kinder, gentler explanation that women began to develop enough sense of self that intimacy with sex seemed to be something that they wanted, and the male either felt the same, that some intimacy was appropriate, um, and thus the bond was formed, and then uh, whether he knows that the children follow from it or not, he certainly can see that there are children and they need to be provided for as well. So he's out there hustling his butt to get some more meat to bring it back. Meat is a very high protein source, and it greatly increases the chances of thriving on the part of the species. The extra protein made a big difference, and of course, fed the growth of the brain. So now, to me, this loop of development, of evolution, includes the growing psychology that included um, a desire for intimacy and sex to be connected. And of course, as the men are increasing their capacity to bring provisioning in, and the rich protein of the meat is helping the brain grow and become more complicated, and the psychology develop and become more complicated, then that could explain how people would choose to begin living in bonded pairs, which is to say that men and women would stop having uh, sex outside of the intimacy of a bond. And of course, because the sex urge is so much older, it's literally thousands of times older than the 2 to 2.5 million time period that we're talking about. I mean, it goes back hundreds of millions of years. because the sex urge is so strong, you can see there's going to be problems. And oddly enough, they persist. Um, but that doesn't mean that the bonding didn't become real. And it's part of Deacon's book is saying, well, when you put the bonding in social living, and they needed the social living to hunt together, they had to know how to get along with each other and to organize things and cooperate. Hunting together was much more successful than hunting separately. And so, as the species is gaining huge benefits from this together part, from the social part, then the bonding comes in. Well, you can see the problem. So here's a man and a woman who are bonded, but they also live in the community. There's nothing like knowing all your neighbors to increase the chances that you're going to feel intimacy with somebody else and have sex outside your bond. I mean, it's just the way life is. And we deal with it today, and sometimes very painfully, and usually very painfully. Um, and we're not going to get into that whole that whole thing today. But so you can see the Deacon's then point is, well, they needed to develop the symbolic communication that became language. As their brains became strong enough to allow that to happen, their social changes that were occurring at the same time, the development of pair bonding and the strengthening of society, created an inherent conflict, and language helped create the structure whereby it became what Jablonka would refer to as habits and practices and preferences. The community said, okay, well, we need to support this new way of living. We need it to be understood that as a community, we don't think cheating is right. And as a community, we'll do what we can to punish cheaters. And that cultural habit and tradition gets passed on from generation to generation and becomes part of the loop, so that the evolutionary loop gets sped up and gets strengthened, and the changes are building on themselves, and hence an enormous separation occurs in the evolution of our ancestor species from their close cousins, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, who just 4 or 5 million years before that were the same species. And somewhere along the line, we left those species, and a series of ancestor species developed. And in due time, they began living as bonded pairs in society. And hence, here we are today. So I really do like the idea of intimacy in evolving in the psychology as the better explanation than the one Deacon offers for why people started to live in pair bonds. Okay, that's enough for today. That's more than enough for today. I told you I had to get a little bit into the weeds. Don't tell Betsy. Okay, see you tomorrow.